August 14, 1944. Hereford, Texas. The air tasted of dust and scorched grass, a taste Elena had never known. It was nothing like the salt tang of Naples, the smell of brine and diesel and baking stone. Here the heat was a dry, pressing weight, a physical thing. She watched the dust devils spin across the immense, flat expanse beyond the wire fence. Nothing to stop the wind, nothing at all. Inside the mess hall, the noise was a low clatter of metal on ceramic. The women sat on long wooden benches, their movements stiff, their faces guarded. Elena held the fork in her hand, a heavy, solid thing, not the thin, tinny utensils from the transport ship. She looked down at the plate, a mound of pasta, slick, with a red sauce that clung to every piece. Bits of dark meat dotted the surface. Next to it, a thick slice of white bread, impossibly soft, and a small glass filled with a dark red liquid that smelled sweet and sharp. Wine. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the other women. Lucia, barely 16, stared at her plate as if it were a bomb. Isabella, whose husband and son were gone, somewhere on the Russian front, held her fork but did not move, her lips a thin, bloodless line. A trick. It had to be a trick. Elena's own stomach, a tight knot of hunger for 2 years, did not believe what her eyes saw. The sauce smelled rich, of cooked tomatoes and onion and something else, something savory. In Naples, the last pasta she'd eaten was a watery broth with a few pale strands floating in it, boiled with potato peels to thicken it. Meat was a memory, a ghost story told to hungry children. She watched an American guard, a boy with a face as smooth as an egg, walk past their table. He didn't look at them, he just walked, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He wasn't starving, his uniform was full, his cheeks had color. The women at her table exchanged glances. No one spoke. The silence was a question. Elena felt the weight of their collective disbelief. They had been told stories about the Americans, monsters, barbarians, decadent capitalists who would let you starve for sport. Yet here was this plate, this impossible plate. She thought of her little brother, his face thin, his eyes too big. What would he think of this? The thought was a sharp pain, a needle of guilt. To eat this felt like a betrayal. To not eat it was madness. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the fork. The metal was cool against her fingers. She scooped a small amount of pasta, brought it to her lips. The sauce was warm, thick. It tasted of real tomatoes, of meat that yielded to her teeth. It was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted, and it was terrifying. Across from her, Lucia began to cry, silent tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Isabella watched Elena, her dark eyes unblinking, waiting for the poison to work, for the trick to be revealed. But there was only the food. An impossible abundance, sitting on a plain ceramic plate in the middle of a Texas desert. The journey to Hereford had been a blur of disorientation. A long, groaning transit in the dark belly of a ship, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear and vomit. Then a train, its windows showing a country so vast and empty it felt like another planet. They were a small group, a few dozen women captured in the chaotic collapse of the Italian front. Nurses, administrative staff, women attached to military units in roles that blurred the line between civilian and combatant. Now they were prisoners of war, a designation that felt both absurd and terrifyingly final. They were anomalies in a system built for men. In Italy, their world had shrunk to the size of a bread ration, to the length of a queue for water. Here, the world seemed to have no edges. The sky was immense, the land stretched to a horizon that never seemed to get closer, and the resources were inexplicable. The camp itself was a city of wood and tar paper laid out in a grid of perfect, brutal geometry. Barracks, a mess hall, an infirmary, a chapel, all built quickly, all functional. It was not a home, but it was solid. It was more than many of them had left behind. In her bunk at night, Sophia, who had been a nursing student in Bologna, would lie awake and try to make sense of it. She would mentally tally the resources she saw every day. The sheer number of blankets, one for every woman, thick and clean, the endless supply of soap in the latrines. The food, always the food. She calculated the caloric content of their daily meals in her head, a habit from her training. It was, she estimated, over 3,000 calories a day, more than double what a civilian in Rome was allotted by the ration cards if they could even find the food to buy. More than what their own soldiers had been getting in the field. This wasn't sustenance, it was sustenance with a surplus. It was a statement, but what was it saying? The women processed this new reality in different ways. Some, like young Lucia, accepted it with a kind of stunned gratitude, as if they had fallen into a strange fairy tale. Others, the older ones like Isabella, remained deeply suspicious. They inspected every meal. They watched the guards with narrowed eyes. They spoke in whispers about fattening pigs for slaughter. They saw the comfort as a more insidious form of cage, a way to make them docile, to break their spirit with baffling kindness instead of predictable cruelty. Elena found herself caught between these two poles. Her body craved the food, the security. Her mind, however, was in a constant state of alert. She watched everything. She noticed the casual way the American supply trucks came and went, kicking up plumes of dust. She saw the crates being unloaded, sacks of flour, tins of coffee, boxes of fruit. There was no sense of scarcity, no rationing. It was a river of supplies, flowing effortlessly into this remote corner of the world to feed them, their enemies. The material reality of the camp was a direct contradiction to everything they had been told, everything they had known. The war for them had been a story of relentless subtraction. Less food, less fuel, less hope. Here, in this cage of wire, they were confronted with an impossible addition, and that mathematical impossibility was more disorienting than any physical hardship. It forced a question they had never thought to ask. What kind of country had so much it could afford to feed its prisoners better than Italy could feed its own children? The contrast was a constant, grinding presence in their minds, a daily inventory of what was versus what had been. It began with the bread. At home, bread was a dense, dark thing, often cut with sawdust or acorns to make the flour stretch. It was precious. A single loaf was guarded, sliced thin, made to last a week. It tasted of grit and desperation. Here, the bread was white, light, and soft. It appeared at every meal, piled high in baskets. The women would watch, mesmerized, as an American cook would casually toss the leftover heels of the loaves into a bin at the end of the meal service. To them, it was like watching someone throw away gold. Lucia once saw a guard make a sandwich, using 2 thick slices of this bread for a single piece of meat, and then eat only half of it before throwing the rest away. She had to sit down on her bunk afterwards, feeling dizzy, the image replaying in her mind. Then there was the coffee. In Italy, coffee was a bitter, roasted barley drink called *caf d'orzo*. It was a ghost of the real thing, a memory of a flavor. Here, the mess hall percolators brewed real coffee, dark and aromatic, and the women could have as much as they wanted. They were even given sugar. White, granulated sugar, in bowls on the tables. Isabella would stir a spoonful into her cup, watch it dissolve, and her face would tighten. She remembered trading her wedding earrings for half a kilo of sugar on the black market a year ago, a secret she kept even from her husband. She drank the sweet, hot coffee, and it felt like an insult. The differences extended to the most basic elements of hygiene. Water in their villages had been rationed, available only a few hours a day. Laundry was a grueling, all-day affair using harsh, homemade soap that chafed the skin. In the camp, hot water flowed from the taps in the washhouse for 2 hours every evening. They were issued bars of soap that smelled faintly of flowers. Sophia, the nurse, noted that the latrines were scrubbed with disinfectant daily. The sheer amount of cleaning supplies, the casual expenditure of hot water, spoke of a system that didn't need to count such things. It was a level of sanitation that civilian hospitals back home could no longer afford. For every tangible good, there was an intangible counterpart. The boredom of the camp was a stark contrast to the constant, humming anxiety of life in a war zone. In Naples, Elena had slept in her clothes, listening for the air raid sirens, her body always tensed for the sprint to the shelter. The loudest sound here was the wind or the distant rumble of a truck. The quiet was unnerving. It gave them too much time to think, to remember, to compare. They would count the differences like rosary beads, hard ground versus a cot with a mattress, one thin blanket versus two wool ones. The constant threat of violence versus the monotonous safety of the compound. The comparison was never favorable. Each point of contrast, the food, the soap, the quiet, was a small, persistent erosion of their old certainties. It chipped away at the image of the enemy they had been given, and it chipped away at their own sense of dignity. To be a prisoner was one thing. To be a prisoner living in better conditions than your own family, that was a far more complicated kind of shame. The women became amateur anthropologists, studying their captors and the baffling system they inhabited. Their analysis was not academic. It was whispered in the barracks after lights out, exchanged in quick, furtive glances across the mess hall table. It was a lived, urgent science of survival and sense-making. Sophia, with her nurse's training, was the most methodical. She kept a small journal, a cheap notebook given to them by the camp administration. In it, she didn't write about her feelings. She wrote down facts. She noted the delivery schedule of the supply trucks. She sketched the layout of the camp. She recorded the daily meal menus in a neat, precise hand. Monday, beef stew, bread, canned peaches, coffee. Tuesday, pasta with meat sauce, salad, bread, wine, chocolate cake. Reading the list back to herself, it looked like a menu from a restaurant in a world before the war. It seemed like fiction. She also observed the guards. They were mostly young men, boys really, from places she'd never heard of. Ohio, Kansas. They seemed bored, homesick, and utterly uninterested in their prisoners. They weren't cruel. They weren't even particularly strict. Their defining characteristic was a kind of weary indifference. Sophia noted how they chewed their gum, a constant, rhythmic motion of the jaw. She watched them drink Coca-Cola from glass bottles, a beverage that looked like medicine, but that they consumed like water. These small, observable behaviors became data points. They pointed to a culture of casual, unthinking consumption that was utterly alien. Isabella, older and more cynical, was the group's skeptic. Her analysis was rooted in a deep distrust of power. "They are not feeding us," she would say in a low voice to Alina as they folded laundry in the wash house. "They are showing us they can." She saw the food not as sustenance, but as a weapon of psychological warfare. "Every piece of bread is a bullet," she insisted. "It is meant to kill your pride." Her interpretation was colored by a lifetime of European politics, where every gesture had a hidden meaning, every gift a price. She would point out the waste, the half-eaten plates, the discarded cigarette butts that were still half full of tobacco. To her, this wasn't just abundance, it was arrogance. It was a display of power so profound it didn't even need to be efficient. Elena's role was that of the quiet observer. She listened to Sophia's facts and Isabella's theories, and she tried to reconcile them with her own sensory experience. She paid attention to the hands of the American soldiers. They were clean. Their fingernails were trimmed. They weren't the calloused, dirt-caked hands of the farmers and soldiers she knew. She listened to the sounds of their language, a lazy, flowing sound so different from the hard consonants of German or the staccato bursts of Italian. She noticed that they never seemed to shout. The orders were given in calm, conversational tones. There was no rage, no fury, no passion. It was also professional. One afternoon, a guard dropped a bar of chocolate near Lucia. He didn't say anything, just looked away and kept walking. Lucia picked it up. She unwrapped it and broke it into small pieces, sharing it with the women in her barrack. As Elena let a small square melt on her tongue, the sweet, rich flavor flooding her mouth, she thought about the guard's gesture. Was it pity, contempt, or was it something else entirely, an act so insignificant to him, so casual that it had no meaning at all? That, she thought, was perhaps the most frightening possibility. The mechanism that delivered this impossible abundance was invisible to the women, yet it structured every moment of their existence. It was a system, vast and impersonal, built on a foundation of industrial might and geographic isolation. What they were experiencing in the Hereford camp was not a special program or an act of extraordinary kindness. It was simply the logical output of the American war machine, an apparatus designed for overwhelming logistical superiority. At its core was the Geneva Convention of 1929, a set of international rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States, unlike Germany or Japan, was a signatory and largely adhered to its principles. One of those principles stipulated that prisoners should be given rations equivalent to those of the depot troops of the detaining power. In simple terms, this meant an Italian prisoner in Texas was entitled to a diet similar to that of a non-combat American soldier stationed at a base in the U.S. Sofia, with her keen eye for detail, began to piece this together. She saw a copy of the camp regulations posted in the administrative office when she was sent there for a minor medical issue. She couldn't read all the English, but she recognized words like rations, calories, and Geneva. She connected this formal language to the laden plates in the mess hall. This wasn't charity, it was policy. The policy, however, was only possible because of a second, more fundamental reality: American agricultural and industrial supremacy. While Europe's farms had become battlefields and its factories were retooled for weapons production, American farms were producing record harvests. The country was a continent-sized factory and farm, protected by two oceans. A schematic metaphor for the system might be a massive, continental-scale conveyor belt. At one end, farms and factories produced a torrent of goods: wheat, corn, beef, sugar, canned goods, chocolate. This torrent flowed onto the belt, which carried it across the nation. A small portion was diverted to places like Hereford, siphoned off to feed a few 100,000 prisoners. But the main flow continued on to feed the American populace and, more importantly, to supply its millions of soldiers fighting overseas. The amount diverted for the POWs was, in the grand scheme of the American war effort, a rounding error, a logistical afterthought. The women in the camp only saw the end point of this conveyor belt. They saw the plate of pasta, the slice of cake. They didn't see the thousands of miles of railroad track, the massive grain silos in Kansas, the sprawling stockyards of Chicago, the automated canneries in California. They were experiencing the output of a system whose scale they could not comprehend. This system was repeatable and scalable. Whether a camp held 500 prisoners or 5,000, the conveyor belt delivered. The menus were standardized. The supply chains were robust. The Quartermaster Corps, the logistical branch of the U.S. Army, managed this with bureaucratic efficiency. A woman like Elena, watching a truck unload identical sacks of flour week after week, was witnessing a tiny fraction of a perfectly replicated process happening at hundreds of camps across the country. The guards' indifference, which Sophia had noted, was another product of this system. They were cogs in the machine. Their job was not to hate or to pity the prisoners. Their job was to follow the regulations, to manage the inventory, to ensure the smooth operation of their small part of the camp. The systematic nature of it all was the key. It wasn't about individual morality. It was about an infrastructure of abundance. The jarring contrast between their past and present lives was not confined to the mess hall. It echoed through every aspect of their confinement, surfacing in new and unexpected domains. One such domain was work. The Geneva Convention allowed for prisoners, other than officers, to be put to work. Given the severe labor shortages on American farms, many of the male Italian POWs were sent out to work in the fields, picking cotton or harvesting vegetables. For the women in Hereford, the work was different. They were assigned tasks within the camp: laundry, mending, kitchen duty, cleaning. The secondary contrast emerged sharply here: the nature of labor in a system of scarcity versus a system of surplus. In Italy, work had been a desperate, unending struggle for survival. Mending a shirt meant carefully picking apart a more tattered garment for thread, patching and repatching until the original fabric was barely visible. Here, in the camp's sewing room, there were spools of new thread, boxes of buttons, and bolts of fabric for patches. When a garment was too worn, it was simply discarded and replaced with a new one from the camp's supply depot. Isabella, assigned to the sewing room, once held a new, perfectly functional shirt that had been slated to be turned into rags simply because it had a small, fixable tear. She sat with it in her hands for a long time, the sheer wastefulness of it making her feel physically ill. She mended it anyway, a small, defiant act of conservation in a world that didn't require it. Kitchen duty provided the most potent examples. For Alina, working in the camp kitchen was a journey into a parallel universe. The scale of the operation was staggering. Huge, steaming vats of sauce, industrial-sized mixers for dough, walk-in refrigerators filled with meat and dairy. The most shocking discovery was the garbage. At the end of each day, the cooks would scrape pans and throw away leftover food, not just scraps and peels, but whole, edible portions. Potato peels were thrown out, not saved for soup. The fatty ends of meat cuts were discarded, not rendered for cooking fat. One data point seared itself into Alina's memory. She watched a cook throw away nearly a gallon of milk because it was one day past its marked expiration date. The memory of her nephew, his bones thin from calcium deficiency, flashed in her mind. The concept of expired food was a luxury she couldn't fathom. In her world, the only measure of food was whether it was rotten or not. This casual disposal of resources inverted her entire understanding of value. It suggested that here, labor was more valuable than materials. It was cheaper to throw away the milk and get a new container than it was to spend time carefully managing every last drop. Back home, it was the exact opposite. Materials were precious, and human effort was endlessly expended to conserve them. This realization was profoundly unsettling. It meant that not only did the Americans have more things, but their entire economic and social logic was built on a different foundation. The women began to see that the abundance wasn't just a matter of quantity, it was a qualitative difference in how the world was organized. The relentless, systemic nature of the camp's comfort began to create a deep ideological friction. The reality they were living in was in direct, violent opposition to the worldview they had been taught. Fascist propaganda had painted a clear picture of the enemy. Americans were portrayed as a decadent, soft, and undisciplined people. They were supposedly individualistic to the point of chaos, their society a corrupt mess held together by money. The Germans, their allies, were the model of efficiency and hard discipline. The women's lived experience in Hereford systematically dismantled this narrative piece by piece. The Americans they encountered were not chaotic. They were the agents of a system of terrifying, almost supernatural order. The camp ran on a precise schedule. Meals were served at the exact same time every day. Supplies arrived like clockwork. The bureaucracy, while sometimes slow, was predictable and consistent. It was a different kind of order than the rigid, goose-stepping discipline of the German newsreels, but it was undeniably effective. It was the calm, quiet order of a factory, not a parade ground. This observation forced a disturbing question. What if the American version of efficiency was actually superior? Role inversions and unexpected displays of competence further complicated the picture. One day, the plumbing in one of the barracks backed up. The women expected a long delay, a botched repair job. Instead, 2 American maintenance men arrived within the hour. They were not soldiers, but older civilians in overalls. Sophia watched them work. They laid out their tools on a clean canvas sheet. They spoke quietly to each other, pointing and nodding. They worked without fuss or drama, and within 2 hours, the problem was fixed. They cleaned up after themselves, packed their tools, and left. Sophia was struck by their quiet professionalism. It was a small thing, a mundane repair, but it was a display of competence that contradicted the image of the bumbling, foolish American. The most profound clash, however, was in the realm of power. The women had been raised in a culture where power was demonstrated through force, through overt acts of domination and control. A guard in Italy or Germany would assert his authority by shouting, by brandishing his weapon, by making the prisoners feel his presence. The American guards, by contrast, seemed to exercise their power through its near invisibility. They rarely raised their voices. Their authority was assumed, not performed. Their control was so absolute they didn't need to constantly prove it. This cool, detached form of power was more unnerving than open brutality. It felt inescapable. Isabella, ever the political analyst, saw it clearly. "A man who must shout is a man who is afraid you will not listen," she murmured to Elena one evening. "These boys, they don't shout. They know we have no choice but to listen." This inversion of expectations created a constant, low-level cognitive dissonance. Their captors were not the monsters they were supposed to be. But what were they? If they weren't evil, then the war itself became morally ambiguous. If their own side was starving while the enemy provided chocolate cake, who was decadent, who was strong? The women's internal processing of this clash was a silent, lonely struggle. They had no new framework to replace the old one. They were suspended between a propaganda narrative that was clearly false and a reality that was too complex and alien to fully grasp. The simple certainties of patriotism and enmity dissolved, leaving behind a troubling and persistent unease. To legitimize their growing, unsettling conclusions, the women began to collect evidence, not in a formal way, but through a shared, subconscious process of observation and verification. Their claims about American abundance were not just feelings, they were grounded in a scaffold of facts, filtered through their daily routines and recollections. The most powerful evidence came from the kitchen. Lucia, who was eventually assigned to help with vegetable preparation, became an unwitting auditor of the camp's supply chain. She didn't need to see official records, she saw the crates. She reported back to the others in the barracks, her voice a whisper of awe. "They opened a crate of oranges today," she told them. "From a place called Florida, there must have been 100 in the box." And there were more boxes stacked behind it. For women who had considered a single, withered orange a luxury for a sick child, a crate of 100 was an astronomical figure. Another time she saw the sacks of sugar. They were stacked 10 high against a wall. She counted them, over 50 sacks. Each one weighed, she overheard a cook say, 100 pounds, 5,000 pounds of sugar. The number was so large it was meaningless, an abstraction, but the physical sight of the sacks was undeniable proof. Isabella, working in the laundry, conducted her own form of accounting. She counted the bars of soap used each week. She noted the volume of hot water. But her most striking piece of evidence was a logistical detail she gleaned from a discarded shipping manifest she found in a waste bin. The manifest listed a shipment of 3,000 pairs of cotton undergarments and 5,000 bars of soap designated for the camp. The manifest was dated for a single month. This single piece of paper quantified the system's output in a way that was both mundane and mind-boggling. The camp held fewer than 500 women. The scale of the provision was utterly disconnected from their actual numbers. Sophia's journal became the closest thing to a formal record. She translated her observations into figures. She noted that each woman received a monthly ration of personal hygiene items, 1 tube of toothpaste, 1 toothbrush, 2 bars of soap, a box of sanitary napkins. She remembered the makeshift rags she and other women had been forced to use back home. The simple, factory-made napkin was a technological marvel, a symbol of an industrial base that catered even to the most intimate needs of its female prisoners. The medical infirmary offered another cluster of facts. When one of the older women developed a severe toothache, she was taken to the camp dentist. She returned not with a pulled tooth, but with a silver filling. She described the sterile office, the electric drill, the anesthetic injection that made the process painless. A dental filling, an act of preservation rather than extraction, was a luxury beyond the reach of most civilians in wartime Europe. The evidence accumulated day by day, piece by piece: a crate of oranges, a stack of sugar sacks, a shipping manifest, a silver filling. Each fact was a small chip hammer breaking down the old walls of their understanding. They were no longer just speculating, They were building a case. The conclusion was inescapable. They were not prisoners of a nation. They were prisoners of a factory. A factory of such immense productive capacity that its surplus, its waste, was greater than the total wealth of their own world. The psychological weight of this sustained cognitive dissonance began to exact a heavy price. The initial shock and disbelief hardened into a complex and corrosive blend of guilt, shame, and a strange, hollow anger. The consequences landed not as abstract ideas, but in their bodies, in the quiet, dark hours on their bunks when there were no distractions from the turmoil within. For Alina, the taste of good food became inextricably linked with guilt. Every bite of beef, every spoonful of sugar in her coffee was a reminder of her family's hunger. She started to eat less, pushing food around on her plate. Her body, finally receiving proper nutrition after years of deprivation, was healing. She was gaining weight, the color was returning to her cheeks, but her mind registered this physical health as a moral sickness. At night she would lie awake, her stomach full, and be tormented by vivid images of her younger brother, his face gaunt, his pleas for bread echoing in her memory. The satiety felt like a betrayal. The feeling was a cold, hard stone in her gut that no amount of food could warm. Lucia experienced a different kind of breakdown. The constant, unearned comfort overwhelmed her. She had been raised in a world of harsh, simple rules defined by scarcity. This new world, with its casual plenty, had no rules she could understand. She began to exhibit strange behaviors. She would hoard things, crusts of bread, lumps of sugar wrapped in paper, hiding them under her mattress. It was an irrational act, a muscle memory from a life where nothing could be taken for granted. One evening, another woman found her stash and reported it. When a guard came to confiscate the pathetic collection of stale food, Lucia collapsed into hysterical sobbing. It wasn't about the food itself. It was the shattering of her fragile coping mechanisms. She was a ghost from a world of hunger, haunting a world of plenty, and she could not reconcile the two. For Isabella, the emotional cost was a deep, burning rage, but it was an anger with no clear target. She was furious at her own government for its incompetence and lies. She was furious at the Germans for their arrogant cruelty, and she was furious at the Americans for a kindness that felt more humiliating than any beating. Their generosity unmanned her hatred, leaving her disarmed and impotent. "I wish they would hit us," she whispered fiercely to Alina one night, her voice trembling. "Then at least we would know how to feel, we would have our pride." The worst moments were the quiet ones. A woman receiving a letter from home, the thin paper filled with carefully coded descriptions of hardship, reading it while sitting on a clean blanket, her stomach full from dinner. The dissonance of that moment was a physical blow. Some women grew silent and withdrawn. Others became irritable, picking fights over trivial matters. The nervous system, kept on a knife's edge for years by the adrenalized threat of bombs and starvation, did not know how to recalibrate in this strange, safe prison. The lack of an external enemy forced the conflict inward. Their beliefs were at war with their senses, and the battle was fought in the quiet theater of their own minds. It was an ordinary afternoon. Alina was on a work detail, pulling weeds from the small, dusty patch of ground the camp commander had designated a beautification project. The sun was relentless. She watched a long convoy of army trucks rumble past on the road outside the camp fence. They were heading east, away from the camp, deeper into the heart of the country. They were loaded with something covered by canvas tarps. At a railway crossing, the convoy stopped. A guard in the tower shifted his weight. For a moment, a gust of wind, the same wind that carried the dust, lifted the corner of a tarp on the nearest truck. For just a few seconds, Alina saw the cargo. It wasn't tanks or guns or soldiers. It was crates. Stacks and stacks of wooden crates, all stenciled with the same markings. She could make out a single word: spam. She had seen the tins in the camp kitchen. It was the processed meat they were sometimes served. This truck, and the one behind it, and the one behind that, as far as she could see, were filled with nothing but tins of meat. An entire army of trucks, dedicated to moving tinned meat across the continent. In that instant, watching the endless procession of food, a thought crystallized in her mind with the force of a physical impact. It was a single, devastating sentence of revelation. This wasn't about them. The food, the wine, the chocolate, the clean barracks, none of it was a message directed at them as prisoners, as Italians, as enemies. It was not a strategy of psychological warfare, as Isabella believed. It was not an act of humanitarian kindness, as Lucia hoped. It was simply a byproduct. The thought landed, complete and unadorned. The American capacity to provide for its prisoners was not a strategic choice. It was the inevitable result of an industrial system so powerful that its surplus was a logistical problem to be managed. The immediate implications of this insight washed over her. First, it meant their theories were wrong. They had been trying to interpret the camp's abundance through a human lens of intention, of kindness or cruelty. But the system wasn't human. It was an engine. It did what it was built to do, produce and distribute goods on a massive, relentless scale. Feeding them was just one of its minor, automatic functions, like an engine's exhaust. Second, it reframed the very nature of the war. They had thought the war was being won by soldiers and generals, by courage and strategy on the battlefield. But Elena now saw that the war had been won here, far from any front, by farmers in Iowa, by factory workers in Detroit, by the men who built the railroads and drove the trucks. It was won by a superior system of production. The German tanks and Italian fighting spirit were no match for an enemy that could field an army of tinned meat. This revelation was not triumphant. It was profoundly humbling. It removed all human agency from their situation. They were not worthy recipients of pity, nor were they the targets of a clever plot. They were simply a rounding error in a vast, indifferent calculation of supply and demand. The food was not a weapon aimed at their hearts. The food was just food. And the sheer, unthinking quantity of it was the most powerful weapon of all. The revelation that it was the system, not the sentiment, that governed their lives allowed the women to begin a quiet synthesis. They started to connect the human-scale moments they had experienced to the larger, impersonal machine that produced them. The new understanding acted as a key, unlocking the logic behind dozens of previously inexplicable details. Cause and effect began to snap into place. The young guard's casual disposal of a half-eaten sandwich was not an act of individual arrogance. It was the natural behavior of a person raised in a system where food was not a precious resource to be conserved, but a cheap, endlessly replaceable commodity. The cause was agricultural surplus. The effect was a culture of casual consumption. The constant availability of hot water and soap was not a special privilege for their benefit. It was the standard operating procedure for any U.S. Army installation, a system designed to maintain troop hygiene and prevent the spread of disease. The cause was a mature understanding of public health logistics, baked into military doctrine. The effect was that enemy prisoners received better sanitation than they had known as free citizens. This analytical lens allowed them to see connections between seemingly unrelated domains. The well-made boots on the guard's feet, the reliable plumbing, and the chocolate cake served for dessert were not separate phenomena. They were all outputs of the same integrated system of mass production and distribution. A system that could produce millions of standardized boots could also produce millions of standardized chocolate bars. The quality and quantity of both were a testament to its power. What this tended to reveal was that America's primary strength might not be ideological or even military in the traditional sense, but logistical. It could move more things to more places more quickly and more reliably than any other nation on Earth. This insight helped dissolve the intense, personal emotions of guilt and shame. If the food was not a gift, then accepting it was not a betrayal. It was simply a condition of their imprisonment. Elena found she could eat a full meal without the old, sharp pang of guilt. The food was still a reminder of her family's suffering, but it was no longer a personal failing on her part. She was a cog in a machine, and the machine had decreed that she would be fed. This did not make her happy, but it made her calm. The women's conversations in the barracks began to change. The fearful whispers about poison and plots faded. The angry denunciations of American decadence grew quieter. Instead, a new tone emerged, one of quiet, sober analysis. They spoke of what they saw with a kind of detached wonder, like scientists observing a strange new element. They had been captured by an enemy they were only now beginning to understand, an enemy whose power was expressed not in overt cruelty, but in the overwhelming, inescapable fact of its material wealth. Their focalization remained personal, but their conclusions became systemic. They had arrived as soldiers and civilians from a particular nation, and they were slowly realizing they were now subjects of a global economic force. The war had taken their freedom, but the camp was taking their entire frame of reference. The sun begins to set over the Texas plains, painting the vast sky in shades of orange and purple. Elena stands near the fence, watching the light fade. In her hand she holds a small, plain cookie saved from the evening meal. It is sweet on her tongue, a simple pleasure, but she no longer tastes it with the same confusion she felt that first day with that plate of pasta. The taste is no longer just a flavor, it is information. It speaks of sugarcane fields thousands of miles away, of massive, efficient refineries, of automated bakeries, of a logistics chain that brought this small, perfect circle of flour and sugar to her hand in the middle of a desert. She sees it not as a trick or a kindness, but as an artifact of a system, a single data point in a vast equation of power. The war will end, they will go home, but the world they will return to is not the one they left. They have seen something here that cannot be unseen. They have learned that a nation's strength is not just in its soldiers, but in its factories and its farms. They have learned that the most decisive weapon is not always the one that explodes. Sometimes it is the one that is simply, undeniably there. The question they will carry home is not about the enemy they fought, but about the world that enemy is building. What happens when the tools of war are not just bombs and bullets, but bread and sugar? What becomes of pride and patriotism in the face of an opponent whose surplus is more powerful than your sacrifice? These are the questions that will linger long after the memory of the taste of that first meal has faded. The answers will shape the century to come. If this story unsettles the ground beneath your feet, it is because the foundation of power is often not where we think it is. To understand what comes next, we have to keep asking why. Subscribe for our next episode, where we explore what happened when these women finally went home. But bread and sugar. What becomes of pride and patriotism in the face of an opponent whose surplus is more powerful than your sacrifice? These are the questions that will linger long after the memory of the taste of that first meal has faded. The answers will shape the century to come. If this story unsettles the ground beneath your feet, it is because the foundation of power is often not where we think it is. To understand what comes next, we have to keep asking why. Subscribe for our next episode, where we explore what happened when these women finally went home.